issues, it may be better.
Yeah, good morning for you.
Hello, so yeah, I can hear you. So Bob, whenever you're ready to take us live, I think I'm seeing some more people join. Let me see if I see.
Welcome everyone. Good morning or afternoon, and welcome you to the September meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board. And I'd like to officially call the meeting to order. Uh-oh, my notes just got taken over by Edmund. Just as a reminder to everyone before we officially get further along, is that this meeting is conducted entirely by remote access because of both the state, federal, and local guidance to protect human health with respect to COVID. So we are going to take written questions and comments from the public. So email your public comments to the DISB at deltacouncil.ca.gov. And in your request, please indicate the specific agenda item that you would like your public comment read. And then if you prefer to give oral comments, you can use the raise hand function or email in Zoom, or email again on the specific agenda item that you would like to provide comment. And then we'll recognize and call for public comments at the end of each agenda item. And please await for us to ask you to provide your public comment, at which time you would state your name and affiliation before that comment. I'd like to take official roll call, and the way we do this is to, I'll call your name alphabetically, and then just give us your full name and whether or not you have any new declarations of conflict of interest. And I'll start first. My name is Steve Brandt, and I have no new declarations. Jim?
Jim Florin, no declarations.
Virginia?
Virginia Dale, no new declarations.
Joe?
Orlando, no new declarations.
Tanya?
Anya Heikola, no new declarations.
Tom?
Walter, no new declarations.
Jay? Okay, Jay Lund is the past chair. He did tell me that he may not make it to this meeting, or he might make it late. He has some issues he has to deal with. So, Diane? Okay, Diane is expected to join us. When she does, we'll ask her to introduce herself. Bob?
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
And Lisa?
Hi, Lisa Ranger, no new declarations.
Okay, I believe we're moving on to item number 2, which is the chair report and business manners. First of all, I'd like to welcome our new board members. This is their official first meeting as new board members. We have 6 new board members. I know all of you attended our August meeting, but this is your official first meeting. And with that, I also want to again recognize our 6 retired board members that have really been a tremendous asset to the Delta. And I think the best thing I can say is during the time on the board that they really have become true friends. And I think we're all going to miss them and their input. Along with that, I want to thank John Calloway and his team for the recruiting process, which brought to us 6 fantastic new board members with a very diverse background. And on behalf of the continuing board members, I really want to express our interest and looking forward to working with you. We know your diverse expertise is really going to be valuable to the Delta. And we also actually hope that you enjoy this process, find it a rewarding experience, and we do look forward to actually meeting you in person and getting together and developing that camaraderie that we think is so essential to the effectiveness of this board. I know you're all aware of the challenges we face these days. The first challenge is we have 6 new board members. That under any circumstance would be a challenge to maintain our productivity and camaraderie with 6 new folks out of 10. But of course, we're also facing now things you hadn't signed on for, which at the same time, which is the pandemic, the social unrest, the compensation issues we're facing, and frankly, for those on the West Coast, the wildfires and air quality issues, which have been, as most of you on the West Coast know, are extremely poor air quality, and it challenges all of us, and particularly our staff in the Sacramento area. And we really appreciate their continued support and effort under these times, because we depend so much on them. Later on today, we're going to talk about how we can effectively move forward and maybe transcend some of these issues, how we still might be effective and accomplish sort of what our real mission is, and both to the state and to the Delta and to the stakeholders that provide those scientific reviews and input that are really so important to the issues facing the region. So we'll talk about that on our last topic. As new members, perhaps the greatest, I think one of the greatest insights you can get is to have a look at the reflections that were written by the past board members. This is something new. We hadn't done it before, but the board members themselves really wanted to express those reflections. And 5 out of 6 of those reflections are based on board members who had been members of the board for the full 10 years. I think they're really an important asset that those reflections are in your package, and I encourage you to read those. And, you know, it's clear when I have a look at those that there's a lot of interesting reflections in there. They talk about how we might move forward, some of the ways we might improve the sort of the value of the reviews we do. There's the, I think many of them express the need to maintain our independence as the independent science board, but also to maintain that balance and sort of the relationships we have with both the science program and the science council. Those are all making us strength while maintaining our independence. I think they all mentioned that the sort of the mutual respect and the camaraderie and the friendships and so forth and teamwork that's developed was really part of why we think we were productive. So I encourage you all to throw out your ideas along the way and how we can develop that camaraderie and maintain that sort of level of productivity, particularly under these times. More specifically, when you go through those reflections, there's a lot of sort of suggestions and recommendations in there that I think are real valuable. And I'd like to set up an agenda item down the road where we can, if you each go through and bulletize some things that you think are really valuable for us to discuss, and we can discuss those ideas and suggestions and recommendations and see if there's any that we might want to implement down the road as we move forward. So again, I want to welcome you all and encourage you to have open discussions, even if it's video. And I know it's hard to jump in on a video thing, but please do. If I'm ignoring you, please let me know that I'm ignoring you. And most of all, keep remembering that Edmund is the source of all knowledge. And he's the guy who can get things done and answer any question that you might have. So the second thing the next thing on my report is to talk about the leadership on the board. And as I think most of you know, we have a chair-elect, and a past chair. And the way it works is that the chair-elect, of course, is elected by the full board, nominated and goes and is elected and agrees to serve. They serve 2 years as the chair-elect, then 2 years as the chair, and then 2 years as the past chair. And those 3 individuals, in many respects, we call it the leadership team, but they're the ones that meet offline and talk about the agendas and get the agenda put together with the program staff and so forth. And it's try to, in many respects, implement various suggestions that you may have along the way and make sure they get incorporated into the activities we do. So the chair-elect position is open. At some stage, when the board feels ready to have that election, then we should have that election and elect a chair-elect who can help us with the leadership and activities and agenda setting on the board. I don't know if anyone is willing and able to jump up now and volunteer to be nominated or self-nominate. Hearing dead silence. If you have an interest, by all means, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. I'm happy to discuss the details and give you some sense of the amount of time commitment that might take. But I think with this high turnover of the board, I think it's a bit of a challenge for you to get a sense of whether or not you want to run away from this opportunity or dive into it. But one thing I'd like to talk about is that we certainly, Jay is the past chair, so Jay and I would certainly appreciate the input of at least one, maybe two other members as we move forward in the short term. So if someone would like to volunteer to help us, and what that would entail initially would just sit in on a phone call and provide their ideas to talk about the next agenda item or the next one after that for the next meeting, and just provide their input and get a sense of what this might entail in terms of how we move forward. You're all experienced enough to kind of have a good sense of what it is, but I think I'm happy to take volunteers now, or if you'd like to send me an email that you would like to help us out, and that's basically what we're asking for now. And be aware that our next chairship meeting is on Monday, and that's just a phone call to talk about what our next agendas might be for the next meeting or two. So is there any thoughts, comments, questions on anything I've said? Anybody want to raise their hand for any volunteer basis now, or okay, well, feel free to, and I hope and encourage at least one, if not two individuals, because what we would really like to have is some, the more diverse ideas and input we can get, the better off I think this board moves forward. So particularly with the new board members, given that Jay and I have been around a while. Okay, are there any public comments on the chair's report?
There are none, but for the record, Diane McKnight has joined us.
Yes, Diane, can you just give us your name and declare whether or not you have any new conflicts of interest?
No, I have no new conflicts of interest. I have stressed out students in my class, but no new conflicts of interest. And I apologize for being late.
Okay, thanks and welcome. The next item is a report by the Delta Stewardship Council and the Delta Science Program. Normally we have these as separate reports, but we're combining them today. And I think it's Susan Tatalian is who's the head of the Stewardship Council, and is Amanda Bull joining you?
Yes, yes.
And Amanda Bull will be providing this report. Go ahead, Susan.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Very quickly, just a couple of items before Amanda tells you about the council's new communication strategy. And after Amanda, Karen Kafitz will give you an update on the California Sea Grant fellow selection. Before those two items, I want to inform you that the council at its August meeting approved a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. So now the council can receive and administer $3.5 million for funding science research related to the 2020-2021 Delta Science Research Proposal Solicitation. So very happy to share that with you today. And the other is that Laurel Larson is officially on board and our lead scientist, and she will be working about 20% until the end of the year, or until she can get situated back in the country. Is that correct, Laurel?
Yes, that is. So I'm working 15% until January 1st, and I anticipate I'll be back in the US in December.
Okay. So
happy to be here and happy to start working with all of you.
yes, we're happy that you're here, virtually anyway. So Amanda, do you want to go ahead and give an update on our new communication strategy?
Yes, thanks, Susan, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new ISB members. I'm looking forward to engaging with each of you. Just a teeny bit of background, I primarily serve as the coordinator of the Delta Plant Interagency Implementation Committee, which is how you'll most often see me here. It's also known as DPIC. But over the last few months, I've also been serving as the Council's acting communications director. And so in this capacity, I just want to briefly update you on some communication upgrades, so to speak, at the Council that also benefit the Independent Science Board. The Council has finalized a communication strategy, which will serve as an overarching guidance document for Council members and staff to follow when communicating about the Council's mission, role, and activities. And this also includes the ISB's activities and role, as well as DPIC's. And as part of the development of this communications strategy, the Council has also refreshed its brand, or its logo. And this updated logo is now live on the Council's website and will be used on all Council, ISB, and DPIC documents moving forward. And in fact, you may have noticed, at least those of you that are returning ISB members, that the meeting notice looks a little bit different this time. So there's the refreshed logo is on there and a new font. So we're kind of excited that we had the opportunity to, through the communication strategy update, to do this. And so we hope you all like the new logo. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about the process that we took to make these changes. Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. Is Karen Kafetz here? Yes, I see you, Karen.
Hi, Susan. Hi to all of the new board members. Welcome. It's really great to have you here. I'm Karen Kafetz, and just for the record, I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Delta Science Program's Science-Based Adaptive Management Unit. And we have a couple of main functions in that unit, but one of them is supporting the Delta Independent Science Board. And so the staff that you have been working with and coordinating board activities, Edmund and Cheryl and Chelsea are all staff who work under me. I'm going to tell you today a little bit about the California Sea Grant Fellowship Program. This is timely because we will be interviewing candidates for the 2021 class next week. The California Sea Grant State Fellowship Program is a cohort of 25 to 30 recent graduates or folks that are finishing their master's or PhD programs. They come in, they're early career scientists. They're coming in from typically scientific programs, though sometimes we have folks who have degrees in management, policy, or even law degrees who come into this program, and they are placed in state and federal agencies across California. This is an opportunity for them to make contributions using their scientific training and backgrounds within those agencies, while also receiving an educational opportunity to get training in coastal resource management. The council overall offers 4 of these fellowships, one in each of 4 different programs, and one of those fellows is placed in the Science-Based Adaptive Management Unit that I administer, and that fellow typically supports part-time or full-time the activities of the Delta Independent Science Board. In the past, we've had fellows help out with various assignments, including organizing workshops and panels, reviewing and synthesizing literature, performing data analysis, and developing report graphics, all to help inform the Delta ISB's review reports and recommendations. Like I said, the interviews for the upcoming class will be taking place next week. There are 18 finalists who have expressed interest in supporting the board, and we'll be interviewing them during a 2-day window next week. Sea Grant then does a magical matching process behind the scenes based on rankings that we provide and that the fellows provide. And so we expect to be matched with a new fellow sometime in October, and that fellow will start next spring. So that's my update, and open to any questions. Thanks.
Is that
Well,
the end of your report, Susan?
That's it. Yeah, if there are no questions, that wraps it up for us.
Okay, thanks. I just have 2 comments. One is on the student fellow, is that the student fellow is an absolute essential component of the board. They have had been a tremendous asset, and so we're really looking forward to for that process to finish up. I believe they start sometime in March or February. Is that correct?
Yeah, it depends on the fellow and when they're finishing their other commitments. Cheryl started with us in April and will run through April. We'll see when a new fellow is going to be able to start. We've had times in the past where the fellows had a little bit of overlap, and there's great benefit there in handing off duties and in training. We've also had small gaps in between fellows, so we'll see, but sometime early next year.
Okay, I also want to officially welcome Laurel Larson to the program as on behalf of the Science Board, and formally invite her at some stage in our in one of our future meetings to give us a presentation on what her vision and plan might be for the Delta Science program during her tenure there. So
I'll be happy to do that. Thank you, Stephen.
I saw Jim's hand up.
Yeah, this is a question for Karen. Karen, I understand that the Delta Science program also has a fellows program. So are these 2 separate programs?
Yeah, so we do quite a bit in collaboration with Sea Grant, and confusingly call a lot of different things fellows. So there are 2 types of fellows that work with the Delta Science program. This is the state fellows. And so these are, like I said, recent graduates who are getting trained to work in policy and management. The other program that we have that's also called Sea Grant Fellows is the Delta Science Fellows. And those are students that are receiving fellowships to be students or postdocs. So typically PhD students or postdocs receive a 2-year fellowship grant to support their active research in Delta programs. So science fellows versus policy fellows.
And that's a substantial number, right? The science fellows?
Yeah, the science fellows class varies in number from year to year based on the availability of funding and how many partner agencies collaborate with us in supporting fellows. But I think the class typically ranges from 10 to 20 people. So there's quite a number of Delta Science fellows out there doing great foundational research. Thanks for the question, Jim.
Okay, any other questions or comments from the board? All right, any public comments on this topic?
There are none.
Okay, thanks. So we'll move on to the next item. I forgot to mention earlier on that during the course of the day, we'll be discussing each of our continuing reviews that are ongoing, and there are various stages in that review process. And but as you heard from the August meeting, we are also looking for members to join us on the writing teams. We have writing teams that sort of take on the responsibility of incorporating any either public comments or board comments into the next version. And we are looking for one or more members of the existing board to join in onto each of those reviews. So as we're going through this, if you have an interest in being part of the writing team, please let us know. We do need your help. And I know part of that will depend on how rapidly we plan to move forward on these in the future. But I think that if this is a topic that is of a particular interest to you, it's worth us to get that input and that commitment to help us at some stage down the road. So think about that as we're going through each of these. The next item is to talk about a discussion and maybe a potential action item with the draft report on ecosystems, or the non-native species report. This one is one of our reviews that is perhaps most mature in terms of its the processes that it has gone through and its current status. We completed a draft in, I think it was July 14th, and after going through a variety of processes, and that was sent out for public comment, which were due on August 24th. And we also, during that time, received comments from board members, the existing board members, on the various drafts, and also on the various drafts. So a revision was completed. That revision was, you have a copy of that revision, I think, in both track change and non-track change form. And in terms of the public comments, we really received two very good, only two comments, but they were both very, very helpful. And we did respond, I would say, positively to all of those suggestions made in the public comment. You have a draft that summarizes you have a document that summarizes our specific responses to the reviews, and I can go through those in a little bit of detail. One was Regional SAN, which provided a very supportive review about our recommendations. They agreed that, for example, that management practices in the Delta should evaluate the full ecological community rather than focusing on a handful of native and non-native indicator species. And so we did add some additional text to kind of strengthen that emphasis on the multi-species ecosystem level evaluation of invasives and its importance in revealing new management options. It also noted that the value of adaptive management experiments, which we had put in there, we agreed and added text to strengthen that point. And then we emphasized the importance of food web models for the Delta. And they agreed with that and alerted to a master's level work that had been done on that, which we did read and add that reference to the review. Bob Peoples, a stakeholder, retired, gave us also a very valuable public comment. And he drew attention to, particularly to the distinction between invasive and non-native species in the context of legislation and policy, and asked whether we prefer the use of invasives because of its appearance in policy documents. And our response to that is that we really did spend quite a bit of time discussing the difference in the definitions of non-native species and invasive species, and we're very careful in our terminology. But one of the things that we did, and I'm not reading from our response, I'm just commenting on it, is that we did look carefully at the use of those two terms. And in some cases where we use the word invasive, it was more appropriate to broaden that to non-native species. You'll see that there's a lot of places, particularly in the latter half of the document, where we did use the broader term because it was appropriate that those recommendations or comments really apply to all non-natives and not just those considered to be invasive. So that was a very, very valuable comment. And that's really what one of the suggestions was, that once something is recognized as invasive, it may be too late to take some action on it because it's already there and has been determined to have caused harm, which is the distinction between an invasive and a non-native, and that therefore it might be too late to prevent it, in a sense. There was also a comment that we emphasize more the plants and animals rather than other things like viruses or microbes. And we did that. We recognize that. We did that because those kinds of organisms are really of greatest concern and receive the most management attention in the Delta, and that bacteria and fungi are generally considered pests and diseases more often handled in agricultural crops. So one other update is that there is a team called the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team. They were part of our panel. They did comment earlier on this document. They did not provide specific public comments on this, but their next quarterly meeting is scheduled sometime in October, and they've asked us to come and speak to them on behalf of the ISB's efforts and take their questions and give them a preliminary report on what we've done. And I've agreed to participate in that meeting sometime in October. So normally what we would have done is we would have the whole board look at this and evaluate it. And the kind of way we evaluate these reports at this stage, after it has received a variety of board inputs and evaluation and discussion, we go through and give it what we call content approval. And what content approval means is that the findings and the recommendations, that everyone agrees with those. They may not like particular wording or edits, but they give it content approval and leave it up to the writing team to, with input from the board, to fix any editorial kinds of things before it goes to a full press option. And that's kind of where we are at this stage. Now, I realize that I don't know if you've all had a chance to look at it or how thoroughly you've had a chance to look at it. So I think we have a couple of options to move forward. The first thing I'd like to do is just discuss the report, see if people have questions or input or disagreements or whatever, and just to have an open discussion on the findings and recommendations for those that are prepared to do that. And then secondly, we need to talk about a way forward on this. I'm seeing three options, but anyone else can suggest further options. One is to just go ahead and give that content approval. It then becomes your product. You will be responsible as a board to help promote it and write a couple pages of summary and do all outreach and so forth. Your name will be on it and it will be your product. So that's what it means once you've taken that vote. We could postpone that vote and give folks a little bit more time to read and digest it, and then have another full discussion of the content, and then move to sort of a voting status. Or we could, if there was enough concern about the issues and that raised, we could take comments now and add to our writing team, which is what we want to do anyway, and then start down the path of redoing it to meet the needs of what this board feels would be appropriate. So the floor is open. Is anybody, what are your thoughts?
Steve, this is Tom. I'd like to see the new members take a good look at it. I don't know how much feedback you've gotten from them so far, but I think that's very important for them, in part just as an educational thing. And also, I read it not as thoroughly as last time, and had a few issues with it. And I don't know if you want to talk about those kind of things right now, or just stick with sort of the mega decision.
Well, I think if there are issues with the content kind of things, I think if people feel comfortable enough, I don't know how many, I hate to ask for a show of hands, how many have actually read it?
Define read. So
Really
yeah,
feel comfortable talking about the content. see sort of a.
I could use some more time to look at it, but I have a question. Can I ask that now?
Sure.
So I understand that there are these periodic reviews of programs and things that we look at, but just having looked at this a little bit, it wasn't immediately clear to me exactly how this gets used or applied. Could you just spend a little more time describing who the recipient is of this and how they're going to use it?
That's a fantastic question, because I think that is, if you saw that's a question we always talk about is, are people paying attention to our recommendations? Who's the target audience, and how valuable are these? Lauren Hastings is undergoing a review of exactly that question. If you look at all of our reviews, they're all a little bit different. And Lauren Hastings from this program has put together a prospectus where she is reviewing our reviews, and has put together, she's going to document the evolution of our process, assess the impact of our reviews, including implementation status of review recommendations, and developing recommendations that might help us to increase the value of future reviews. Ultimately, our reviews go to the council. We make a specific presentation to the Delta Stewardship Council on those recommendations. And sometimes we also make presentations to DPIC, which represents all of sort of the major agencies in the area. Some of the reviews, I would say, are very targeted towards a specific audience. The review of the Interagency Ecological Program was designed for the directors of the Interagency Ecological Program to take into account. The review that we're doing on the Science Needs Assessment is specifically designed as a report to DPIC. We always have the question of whether we ought to single out who should take the action for each recommendation. I think in most cases we haven't. We've done that more as to both the science and management community would be the target audience. That's clearly something that we want to continue talking about, and all possibilities are on the table on future reviews on how we might do that. I don't know if I've answered your question or not.
Yeah, thanks. And I apologize if I'm sort of missing some context as a new board member, but I have done a fair bit of work in invasive species economics. And so I'd be happy, I'm more than happy to take a good look at that. From what I saw, it looked great. So I doubt I'd have any major suggestions, but possibly one might move toward some more specifics was sort of the only comment I had in that. But again, that would depend on if there was a group with particular authorities or programs that you were informing. So it doesn't sound like that's particularly true in this case. You mentioned the board that you're going to present it to, but that was my only comment.
And that's a good comment, and that's the second person who's said that to me. I've got a board member that mentioned that, and in some cases it has to be general because no one has a specific authority to take a particular action, and in some cases, it depends on the level of the recommendation. If it's a very detailed recommendation versus a very broad recommendation. So Tom, did you want to? And then I see Joe next, and then Diane. So Tom, did you want to mention your?
Yeah, I know the nomenclature was a challenge in the initial drafts of the thing, and I didn't feel like it had been totally cleaned up. The word invader is used a lot as a substitute for invasive species, and I just found that distracting because if you're not a specialist in this area, you have to think a lot when you see a word. And so that I did a word count on it, and invader was used 58 times and invasive species was used 84 times. So invader is still a problem. Bob Peoples' comment about the microbes was one I had made earlier, and I think that's important enough that it requires a little more description, because it's not all going to be agricultural. I mean, for example, to take kind of a silly situation, what would happen if the striped bass started being affected by some invasive microbe. I mean, the nomenclature is going to get all messed up there, but I think the pandemic really reminds us how important these things can be. And the last one, I'll have to go back and look again, but the transition from being an invasive or a non-native species to an invasive, it seemed to me when I just reread the document that it particularly with the use of neutrino, it starts off with it being an invasive species rather than a non-native species. And so I would look at those conclusions, and I will do that more carefully to see whether that flow that you were talking about is being used in the new edition.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, Tom, because we have tried to be extremely careful about that, and the process of invasion, that's not an easy term to replace, and we've even looked at sort of other ways of saying it, which we have done into a, you know, when one enters and becomes established without going through that a non-native species enters and successfully establishes itself. Without having to say that every single time, we did use the term invader or invades, let's put it that way, as a verb, and a non-native species can invade without becoming an invasive species, which is very challenging terminology. But we're happy to take any suggestions on that, Tom. We, meaning me, I'm the only one left in the group. And now Lisa's joined, and we need at least maybe one other person. Joe, go ahead.
It's a little, of this conversation. I just want to let you know when Lisa's comment that maybe you might want to say how we select the topics and what the procedure, because it's kind of a very what you call rigorous procedure we go through to come to the stage of the writing. So you might want to just, because of the benefit of the new members, you might want to say how we select the topic and what's the procedure we go through.
Okay, I'll try and summarize that. I know Liz gave you all a presentation back in August on how we do that. How we will do it is really up to you all. So there's nothing that's set in concrete or stone, other than maybe we put together a prospectus. The way the topics are chosen has evolved. Many of the original sort of topics were taken right out of the Delta plan. If you read the chapter titles on restoration, on impact of water flow, on fishes, and so forth, and water quality, those are taken right out of the Delta plan. So those are the major topics identified there, and those were the topics that were reviewed. Over the course of a few years, we've also done things like we held once, for example, about 3 years ago, we called it a retreat, but it was actually at the Delta King in Sacramento, where we first sent out a survey asking folks, how can we improve our process along the way, and what sort of topics you think are really relevant that we ought to be looking at. And then we had a series of panels and an open public meeting to get a variety of ideas. And from that exercise, I think we picked out at least 3 of our topics. And I think we have a guidance now that also says that in each review, we will make sure we look at these 6 or 7 different items, that just to see whether or not they ought to be thought about: uncertainty, climate change, interagency collaboration, a variety of things like that, that were sort of to be essential items to look at in each of the reviews. We then discuss the review a lot amongst the board and talk, water quality is a big topic, but we discuss it. We have people who are interested in it form a writing team, and they put together a prospectus, which is a 2 or 3 page document that says, here's what we're going to do, here's why we're going to do it, here's why it's important, here's how we're going to do it. then that goes out for public review. That was a new element we instituted about 3 or 4 years ago. So we get public input on not only the process, but on the topic and on the value of the kinds of recommendations we might make. And then we move forward through the review process. And each review process is different in terms of the degree of literature, the degree of surveys and panels and seminars, and the process of how it's done based on just based on the topic itself. We also seek public input throughout the process. Many of those we have interviews, and we have detailed interviews with agency folks so we can try and make the recommendations most relevant. We're going to be talking about that when we talk about the monitoring program. We did not do that in this particular review. We went through panels of people who are familiar with invasive species and so forth. That's very briefly. Joe, does that cover what you thought? Or I miss anything?
Certainly that will cover, and that shows that these reviews are quite embedded with the stakeholders. Because it's kind of continuous input from the stakeholders.
Thanks, Joe. Diane?
Yeah, I have a comment on the report that's, I think, in this minor category, and I haven't read it as, and the whole report as detailed a way as I would like, but I was struck at the beginning, sort of this litany of failures. The pythons in the Everglades, the box about the Great Lakes, and that isn't necessarily very empowering for going forward. And is there an example of some management successes that could also be mentioned in the same introductory way? I mean, I'm not sure what those would be. I vaguely know about the efforts in New Zealand to keep this Didymosphenia geminata, nicknamed rock snot, that's in the South Island out of the North Island. And I'm not sure of the status of that, but there's been some successes with serious effort. Is there, can we have is it, if it's all hopeless anyway, why are we, so anyway, just a little bit more empowering to the possible benefits of a serious effort. And I don't think that's a substantive change in the recommendations, but could set the tone. And I haven't had chance to research for what would be better example. What would be a balancing kind of example?
I've got some.
That's a great idea.
Great.
Jim.
Yes, Steve, I read this report fairly carefully because we have so much to learn. And I thought this would be an opportunity to dive into what are these ISB reports and how are they structured and who do they target? And I was a little bit surprised by this report because it almost reads like a review paper on the subject published in a scientific journal. A lot of the text in this is very scholarly. I think it probably could be published. It will be the definitive resource that people want to read about non-native species, both globally and from a Delta perspective. It obviously took a lot of time and effort. I mean, I can imagine the amount of effort that went into doing all the background reading, and it's up to date. I mean, a lot of current citations. And then the report has a number of recommendations, and I think all of the recommendations follow from the content of the report. They make sense. The only comment I have is that although all of those recommendations are excellent, if I was on the management side and I open up this document, I would go right to the recommendations. That's the first thing that I would read. And I would, it's daunting. I mean, the number and complexity of the recommendations is daunting. So does that, what does that mean to give a number of recommendations, each of which would cost a substantial amount of money, take a substantial amount of time? What does that do to the likelihood that any of the recommendations is actually going to be taken? So my thought is, why not prioritize those, and in particular pick one or two that the board thinks is especially important. And if 3 years down the road, we can see that this report had an impact through making one recommendation, it was enacted, and look at the consequences.
Great, thanks. I think that's very good advice. One of the evolutionary parts of this review was that at one stage, just in the vegetation issue alone, a lot of work's been done on invasive vegetation in the Delta, a lot of good science and a lot of good things. One could have put together many recommendations that are specific just to the vegetation, but in terms of control, in terms of science needs, control and so forth and that. So as we evolved, our recommendations became more general. I think being involved in the writing of this one, perhaps if you think of a continuum of recommendations to the ones that might be IEP, for example, which is specific to a specific program within the Delta, and that one is perhaps, and maybe the monitoring, very specific to what's going on specifically in the Delta. And as you progress to water quality and some of the other ones, they become issues that are also more broad in terms of on a national basis in other large areas. I think we are on the extreme side of the continuum with invasive species, in that every single issue, one could argue, that's in the Delta is the same as in the Chesapeake and the Great Lakes and a variety of other areas. We're not proposing things that haven't been done or haven't been considered in other areas on a national and frankly international basis. So it's a very, very broad topic that has that is not specific to the Delta. There are Delta specific issues, but anyway, they're more broad. So any other comments or? Yes, Tanya.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I also had a chance to read through the report just this morning, though. So, I had to skim kind of the last section because the meeting was starting. But yeah, I mean, it's a great report and really well written, and you all did a tremendous amount of work. So it was very educational for me as well. I would just kind of, I guess, build off of some of the comments Jim was making and also Lisa earlier, and I know you already addressed this, Steve, probably in different ways, but the things that did strike me in reading the report were the recommendations and kind of thinking about, what's the appropriate actor for or organization for implementing some of these. And I hear you when you say, well, some of these might hit multiple organizations and are more broad to a broader set of decision makers or managers or research community, et cetera, within the Delta. But I do wonder to what extent the likelihood of taking up those recommendations is improved if some of them are at least more targeted toward a particular body or a particular decision-making authority. And yes, this gets presented to the council, but to what extent is it easier to kind of ignore recommendations when they're not as specific as they could be on who should take that action? So I think it's broader than just this report. It probably comes up in a lot of reports that, we want recommendations to be taken up, and not quite sure perhaps maybe who the best recipient of that recommendation might be, or there might be multiple groups that should be considering it. So I think it's just something that the board needs to be thoughtful about, and perhaps this review that's going to be coming out of the ISB reviews might give a little bit of insight on what some of those characteristics are of reports that are, more likely to be implemented or have an effect on kind of management decisions and those types of things. But yeah, it just the kind of the likelihood of uptake was something that struck me, and certainly worth more consideration or thought. In terms of the content, I think it's great, and I think the recommendations make sense, absolutely. But yeah.
Jim?
You guys are probably really sick of this report. I probably would be pretty sick of this report at this point and ready to everybody sign off on this. But I wonder if it would be a good idea to have use one of our meetings to discuss the recommendations in some detail. Who would be the logical organization, institution to implement the recommendations? Is there even a chance that we could prioritize them, select a couple to highlight? Just a thought about, rather than signing off on this right now, let's take at least one more step and talk about the recommendations, because that's where the potential impact of the other.
I think that's a great idea. One of the challenges we often face is that, let me speak for myself, being not from the region, it's a challenge to figure out who has the responsibility. And we know in this particular review, we looked at the various entities that have invasive species responsibility, particularly at the state level, with the Delta, not Delta, but I think it's a California Invasive Species Council, things like that, which again are a conglomerate of organizations. And the challenge, which I think is worth facing, but the challenge is to have people in the room that know who does what and what their responsibilities might be. We could say DPIC, which includes a broad array, and they're the ones who are, in a sense, leading the nutria coordination, or at least supporting the nutria coordination of stopping nutria invasions. But that's one of our challenges, is making sure we know who those agencies are in this particular circumstance. So, Jim, I think you should definitely help us out with that. You're the likely one who knows more probably than most others on the board on that topic. And if there's other people that we think we could talk to, that might be useful too, to get the names of some folks that we think we could just have a conversation with. We often do have conversations with agency folks. We had intended on doing some interviews, and we did not do those with this particular review. But if there are folks that we could talk to other than the panelists, we could again ask that same question back to the panelists that we had, which does cover a breadth of the folks that deal with this topic. That's a long-winded way of saying I agree. Jim?
One of the one of the things about this report and this topic of non-native species is that it touches on a number of broad science topics that extend beyond non-native species. And so, you know, in the Delta, and maybe this is true universally, one of the major disruptions is disruptions of food webs. You know, top-down control that wasn't there before, or changes at the bottom that propagate up. And that is an issue, that's a topic, disruption of food webs, that is pervasive across many of the programs that are responsible for science and monitoring in the Delta. And one of your recommendations was to build a quantitative food web model, a spatially explicit and quantitative food web model for the Delta. That's a recommendation that has relevance that extends far beyond the non-native species topic. I suspect a lot of agencies would be really interested in supporting that kind of effort.
Yeah, and that's maybe one that we can make a specific recommendation as to who might do that. I know in the case of the fish and flows, we ended up making a recommendation of an integrated modeling effort that married both hydrodynamic and sort of mechanistic fish models. And the science program under John took that on as an initiative and created I don't know if it's a committee or a team or working group or something that's dealing with that right now. So that is something where we could ask someone like the science program to take that on as a funding initiative or as a workshop or something like that. you know, and maybe a way to handle this is we take the recommendation and this particular case and say, as a first step, we could ask agency X to do this to initiate the process. And then we get something more specific into that, in those recommendations where somebody needs to take action. Yes, Lisa.
That topic in particular brings up the question for me, is there a role for us to dig in more narrowly? Like, you know, what kind of models have been created elsewhere? Could any of them be readily adapted? You know, and you know a lot more about fish modeling than I do, but I wonder, do we ever do that? Sort of say like, well, this recommendation really needs it. This piece needs a deep dive. Is that a role for the board, or is that always a role for the science staff?
The answer is variable. I think if we talk about the water supply reliability and perhaps the levee thing we did more of a deep dive into specific methodologies on those. There's nothing that's stopping us from doing that kind of thing, if, you know, as a follow-up to our own, if we decide that we really want to pursue that in more detail, we could do that.
Probably that should be part of a larger discussion that Tanya brought up. So yeah, that maybe that's one way also to get recommendations implemented.
Okay, Tom?
I sort of want to go the other direction with this. I sat in on the IEP session on I think it was called the application of science to management, or but anyway, what it raised in my mind was the question, I don't have a really good sense of how a lot of the science is actually being used. That it's easier to understand the monitoring, but it got me wondering if there's a lot of science research that's actually not being used in management. And this gets to the whole issue of whether the adaptive management is really being done in the most efficient way. And at some stage, I think it might be worthwhile to have a panel of maybe decision makers that focus specifically on how the science is being used in a very broad sense in the Delta. Your cross-cut budget that you distributed, I think maybe a couple months ago, was very helpful, but it really doesn't get to the issue of how the science is being used. It helps you with, you know, who's doing monitoring and that kind of thing, but just trying to answer that question, I think, would be very helpful to the board.
Thanks, Tom. Any other comments or? Okay, let me summarize where I think we're at, and then see if we can find a way forward. It seems like there's enough suggestions for improvements that we're not in a position to, in essence, to vote on moving this forward today as an accepted document. I've heard that we want to really look at the recommendations, see if there's any specific agencies attached to those. We want to perhaps do some prioritizations. We want to make sure we have, perhaps in the beginning or throughout, some evidence of success so that we can turn some of this into a more of inspiration to do this, because it has been done in the past, and also a specific suggestion about writing a paragraph or so on the microbes as a component of that. So what I'd suggest we do, and see if you're all in agreement, is that we, depending again on how we plan to move forward, but let's assume we plan to move forward in some way or form, that have a specific discussion on this, a full meeting, a full hour meeting or so on this, give people a little bit more chance to read it. But I would suggest that we have our writing team to go forward and put forward a draft on these specific recommendations. Drafting of who might be initial ideas. So we have something down. We're not totally just starting from scratch again. Some ideas on on all of the things I just mentioned. And then they could lead a discussion on those particular topics and have a full board input on it, and see if we want to even, we could even draft that text. We may not have specific agencies identified, but we at least have a process forward on how we might identify those. And does that seem reasonable? I'm seeing a.
Steve, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, I don't want you to lose Jim's suggestion that we think about highlighting a few recommendations. And so there would also be a need for a conversation of picking the ones we want to highlight.
Good. And I wasn't going to lose that because I was going to ask Jim to be on this writing team and Lisa. And Jim was on our panel, so I don't see how we can possibly get out of this. But are you guys willing to help out on that?
I am, yes. I'd just like to say one thing about microbes. We know so much about fish and zooplankton and benthic invertebrates in this system. We know virtually nothing about microbes. And so I'm not sure that there's really much to harvest here along that theme. I mean, we can do some research, but I don't think we're going to be able to say much, if anything, about invasives at the level of microbes, bacteria, or I mean, just even bacterial processes aren't being measured here, like nitrification and denitrification. It's just a component of the Delta. It's a very well studied system, but that particular component of the prokaryotes is just very little known about it.
Does anyone feel they have the expertise to write a short blurb on the microbes in general in terms of invasive issues? Okay, it sounds like Jim was our expert on that. We do, by the way, have, I don't want to publicly commit them to this, but I know that both John and Joy have a vested interest in this, and I think if we ask them to help at some stage, I think they would volunteer their efforts to help since they are co-authors, but I don't want to tap them unless it's something that's really worth their time. But I will ask them about the microbes to see, because I know Joy had mentioned a few things about that. But it could just be that we would just say that microbes are an issue, but we know nothing about it, and maybe somebody should look into it and see if there's anything in the literature from other areas.
Steve, do you see that Laurel has her hand up?
Who's got her hand up?
Laurel.
Laurel, hi. I can't see
I
you.
just wanted to contribute something to the conversation about microbes. So I've been meeting with the State of the Bay Delta Science team recently, and we're thinking about how to stage the next 2 issues of State of Bay Delta Science, the first one to come out in 2022 and the second in 2024. And right now, there's been a lot of discussion about putting out an issue focused on primary producers with some summary of the research that's been done on invasive aquatic macrophytes, but also some discussion of harmful algal blooms and Microcystis. And so that, I think there's going to need to be some coordination internally to make sure that our efforts there are not duplicative of the Independent Science Board efforts, but that we also highlight the work that you guys are doing. I wanted to say that the bit about harmful algal blooms and the fact that there has been a lot of work done on that in the Delta in the past few years, and that might be something that you would consider highlighting in this review.
You're talking about harmful algal blooms in the context of invasive species?
Yeah, we had some internal discussion about whether Microcystis could be considered invasive in this context because it has been present for a long period of time, but warmer temperatures are elevating it to problematic levels. Can you guys hear me? I am getting the message that my internet connection is unstable, and we're actually in the midst of a windstorm here in Finland. So it might be coming in and out.
It's breaking up a little bit, but so far I think we've heard everything.
Okay.
This is Jesse from AGP Video. You are sounding clear from our end.
Okay.
Yeah, we hadn't thought about that, but I think we'll be talking about harmful algal blooms towards the end of the day. Because I guess I don't know if Microcystis is. We did not discuss issues where a native species has gone out of control, and we've tried to limit it to those that are
non-native. Yeah, that makes sense.
I will just add that there are some places where there are brand new HABs coming in as conditions change. So it's as a forward-looking issue, it is an issue in some areas.
Is there anyone else who wants to join this writing team? Okay, so what I'll suggest, and Edmund takes down the action items, is that this writing team will exchange some emails and think about a way forward, given these comments we had. I would suggest if you get a chance to read it and read further and have anything else that you'd like us to consider in that sort of 1 hour focus meeting, or in terms of topics to discuss, to send me an email, and then we will put together probably put together a specific meeting to specifically discuss this topic as a at the full board level after we've made some changes to reflect the comments we've received.
Steve, if we have minor editing suggestions, little things, do we send them to you or copy Edmund on that, or what's best?
I would send them to Edmund at this time, because he tends to put together, if we get just editorial things, a combined editorial edits. But I'm thinking we're going to be, I'm not sure I worry about those edits. I'm trying to think a lot if we're going to, how much we're going to shift this thing, but edits don't hurt. So I would send them to Edmund. Does that make sense to everybody? Or do we have a way forward?
Sounds good.
Okay, I'm not seeing any objections, so I think we're accept any public comments on this particular topic. Edmund, do we have any public comments? Well, I don't see.
This is Karen. I don't know what happened to Edmund, but we have not received any public comments to my knowledge on this item.
Okay, then Karen, are you taking the notes for action items then in his absence?
I did not take the notes for action items. I did not realize he was absent, but I am able to monitor the comments.
Okay.
This is Jesse with AGP Video. I believe I just saw someone from the attendees list raise their hand, and then they lowered it. Clyde Williams.
I guess if you want to make a comment, raise your hand again. Okay, I'm seeing Clyde Williams. So could you introduce yourself and your organization and provide your public comment? I think you can go ahead.
Mr. Williams has been allowed to talk, and he has unmuted himself, but I am hearing nothing.
Okay, Clyde, if you can hear us, we can't hear you, so I think you're still welcome to provide a written public comment. And his hand is down. So, all right, with that, we'll move on to the next item, which is a new staff presentation by Chelsea Batavia. Chelsea joined the Delta Science program in July of 2020 and is now part of the Delta ISB staff support team. And she's going to help support our interviews along with the monitoring enterprise review. And because she has experience in applying social science research methodologies. And what we do when we get a new person attached to the board in particular, we give them an opportunity to provide a presentation so we can get to know them better, get to understand their background and how we might be most effective working together. So I think Chelsea, floor is yours.
Good morning. You got it, Chelsea. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you all for inviting me to take a little bit of time and introduce myself today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And if everybody could please let me know. Are you able to see that?
Not yet.
Chelsea, I'm not able to see it yet. You have been allowed to share.
Let's see, screen to share. Okay. And I'm actually going to turn my camera off. I apologize for that, but
Chelsea, we can see your desktop now.
Oh, you can. Great. Well, we'll just continue. It seems like my internet is behaving. Is that good?
Yes, we see
Okay.
your PowerPoint.
Perfect. Thank you. So I titled my talk today, Forestry FTES and Feminist Philosophy and Interdisciplinary Journey in Conservation Ethics. I know that is a long jumble of words that don't very obviously belong together, but hopefully you'll get a feel for what they mean and how they link together in the next 15 minutes or so. I'm going to walk through the forestry FTES, et cetera, part a bit later, but for now I want to just linger for a moment on the conservation ethics piece because I'm not sure that that's a widely recognized phrase, especially for people who work in the sciences in my experience. So before we can talk about conservation ethics, it's probably worthwhile to clarify just what do I mean by ethics. It's a term that's used in a few different ways at least, but when I talk about ethics today, I'm actually going to be talking about a specific branch of philosophy called moral philosophy. Those two terms are used interchangeably. Okay, so what is ethics or moral philosophy? My favorite description is, this is just from my readings over the years, from a philosopher, G.E. Moore, who described ethics as the effort to understand the nature of proper human conduct. And what I especially like about this definition is that word conduct, which is broad enough to encompass all manner of human activity, from thoughts and actions to intentions, motivations, feelings, etc. Now, when moral philosophers set out to understand proper human conduct, their interests are primarily in developing prescriptions for human conduct, not descriptions of human conduct. And by prescriptive, what I mean is that they're articulating an understanding of how humans should conduct themselves. Now, this is a really important distinction with the social sciences. So social scientists describe human beings. They investigate how humans are or what humans do. But in that scientific capacity, they don't really have anything to say about how humans should be or what humans ought to do. That is the realm that should and ought is the realm of ethics. Another focus in moral philosophy is in understanding the nature of value. And when moral philosophers talk about value, they're talking about a property of goodness. And this is another important distinction with various branches of the social sciences. So in economics and psychology, for example, there's very different understandings of what value means, but this is what we mean when we talk about it in ethics. Now, for value, of course, one of the most important distinctions that's discussed in moral philosophy is between intrinsic and instrumental value. So instrumental value is the value or goodness of a thing as it benefits or contributes to some other things, versus intrinsic value, which refers to the value of a thing in itself or for its own sake. So for example, a lawnmower or some tool like that might have instrumental value to you insofar as it has utility, right? But it doesn't have any value in itself. By comparison, perhaps your next door neighbor's daughter may have instrumental value if she mows the lawn for you, but you also recognize that she has intrinsic value. She has value in herself as a human being. So intrinsic value is especially interesting to moral philosophers, and a lot of work has been done trying to identify what has intrinsic value in the world. And these are some of the top suspects that have been discussed. Now, when we're talking about value, obviously we are talking about making value judgments. You can't empirically measure whether something has value, or the intrinsic value of beauty, for example. Intrinsic value or other kinds of value have to be deciphered by other means. I want to say just a couple more things about these value judgments. First, even though they're not in themselves empirical, they are not entirely independent of empirical observations. So for example, if you make the value judgment that a beautiful tree has intrinsic value, that judgment is itself predicated on the observation that the tree has certain properties that are considered to be beautiful. The second point I want to make about these value judgments is that on their own, they don't tell you what you ought to do. So maybe you determine that some fish species, you believe that that fish species has intrinsic value. That judgment in itself doesn't mean that you should do anything in particular with regard to the fish species. To make that determination requires an additional inference about what moral obligations you have toward the fish species as a bearer of intrinsic value in the context of the decision you're making. So tying all this together, we can see that there's a link between what is, which is usually based, at least to some extent, on empirical observation, to our value judgments about what is good, and from there, finally, to our final step, which is to decide, based on what is good, how one ought to behave in the world. Put differently, to conclude that I or we ought to do something requires one to combine descriptive information with value judgments. Okay, so why have I taken all the time to walk you through this? Well, that's because to the extent that I have any core conceptual framework underpinning all of my work in conservation ethics, this would be it right here. And with that background in place, I can actually explain conservation ethics pretty quickly. So in general, conservation ethics is the endeavor to understand the nature of proper conduct in conservation or as conservationists. But more specifically, and at a more methodological level, conservation ethics involves evaluating both the descriptive claims and the value judgments that underpin conservation activities to assess whether and how they are justified. Okay, so now we can finally get into the weeds, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how I use this framework in my own research. And I'm going to start with the first in my sequence, which is forestry. So forestry has been the backdrop of my research, really. I was in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, which is housed in Peavey Hall, which used to look like this and unfortunately now looks like this. At OSU, I was also a member of the long-term ecological research program, or LTR program, affiliated with H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, which is a temperate rainforest in the Central Oregon Cascades. This is what it looked like pre-fire. I'm sorry to say that the forest has not fully escaped fire activity recently, but this is what it would normally look like. So as a new graduate student steeped in this forestry context, in 2013, I started my master's work, which was an ethical analysis of something called ecological forestry in Western Oregon. So to give you a little bit of background, for various reasons, logging on federal forest lands in the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon, has been reduced far below historic levels, and some would argue that it's far below desirable and sustainable levels. So there have been various strategies proposed to increase the harvest level without compromising other environmental objectives. And ecological forestry was one of these strategies. Basically, the idea is to implement relatively low intensive logging across more extensive tracts of federal forest lands by trying to harvest in ways that mimic natural processes of disturbance, which in our case are primarily wildfire. So at the time, this was 2013, 2014, there were active proposals to implement these ecological forestry practices on a certain set of federal lands, though in sea lands shown here on the map on the right. But these proposals were extremely controversial, which you can see from the image on the left, which is of a billboard. And basically the issue is that a lot of vocal interest groups were suspicious that ecological forestry was a way to just reinstate ecologically damaging and ultimately financially motivated clear-cutting practices. So in all of this debate, there were a lot of factual claims and value judgments being batted around. And so for my master's work, what I set out to do was untangle that mess using a systematic philosophical method, it's called argument analysis, to examine and evaluate both the scientific and the ethical claims that people were making when they said that we should or should not use ecological forestry on these ONC lands. Over the years, I've continued to interact with forestry, but even as I was kind of rounding out this master's work, I was starting to develop some other and ultimately more enduring interests. So for example, later in 2014, I became interested in the then topical debates that kind of wound down now, but very controversial at the time, about this idea of new conservation. So new conservation was an approach for conservation that was being advanced by some pretty prominent voices in the conservation world. So for example, some of the leaders were figures at the Nature Conservancy. Now there's a lot of components to the new conservation idea, which I'm not going to discuss here, but one key theme that they emphasized was putting humans at the center of conservation. And this showed up in a number of ways, but the one that I was especially interested in was this claim that if conservationists want to build social support for their work, then they should emphasize the benefits that nature provides for humans. Now, this got a lot of people up in arms because it ran contrary to the core ethic that had been embraced in conservation biology since the mid-1980s. And that's articulated, for example, as the first organizational value of the Society for Conservation Biology, that there's intrinsic value in the natural diversity of organisms, the complexity of ecological systems, and the resilience created by evolutionary processes. So a lot of people in conservation thought that emphasizing human benefits, instrumental values, to use our terminology, that was selling out on this core message that nature has intrinsic value and should be protected for its own sake. So at the time, I fell on that side of the debate as well. And in 2016, I did some work just exploring that kind of ethics value side of the program. But I also realized the new conservationists were making this core empirical claim about humans and human behavior. And I decided I wanted to evaluate that claim scientifically. And that exercise turned into my dissertation work. And this brings me to the F-test segment of my talk. I will admit the label was primarily motivated by alliterative purposes, but also gives a nod to the mountains of ANOVAs I ran in this part of my journey. I'm going to go through this really quickly, but my dissertation was based on some online survey work. It was a long survey, but for our purposes, the relevant component was a measure of what I called moral inclusivity. So on Earth, we have a lot of different kinds of beings, humans, other animals, plants, species, ecosystems. And moral inclusivity refers to the idea of how many kinds of beings or entities count in a moral sense. So how large and diverse is a person's moral community? So I developed a measure to get at that construct and then did an experiment where I showed people carefully designed messages that were presented as promotional flyers for conservation. So I have a couple examples shown on the right here. And there were seven total flyers in total, excuse me. We had a few response variables, but the one that I'm going to talk about is donations. So do people make a monetary donation for conservation after seeing these flyers? So our main research question was, do messages that emphasize conservation's benefits for humans, in fact, elicit higher donations, with the hypothesis that donation responses to different messages would actually depend on a person's level of moral inclusivity. So what we found was that messages emphasizing conservation for humans were actually less likely overall to elicit donations than messages emphasizing conservation for non-human beings. But the most surprising finding was with the amounts that people donated. So in this figure, the labels on the x-axis refer to different value orientations expressed in the message flyers. So the left panel corresponds to the message that we should conserve nature only for humans. Center, we should conserve nature only for non-humans, and right, we should conserve nature for both humans and non-humans. And what we found is that people with the lowest inclusivity, shown here in the blue ovals, which are first in sequence in each panel. So these are people who basically said they only include humans in their moral community. These less inclusive individuals actually made larger donations when they saw messages emphasizing nature for its own sake compared to messages saying we should protect nature for humans. So obviously this is one study and all studies have limitations, but I'd say this was at least just of evidence to challenge the new conservation assumption that nature for people messaging is more effective than nature for nature's sake. We also did some additional analysis from this work comparing different measures of moral inclusivity at different levels of abstraction. And that was a great big mixed model ANOVA. I'm showing the results here. Please don't even try to read this. I really only put it up to bolster my case for calling this segment of the talk F-tests. So that was the official graduate work, but behind the scenes, I was also starting to question some of the axioms that I had previously accepted in conservation ethics. I grew a little bit tired of intrinsic value and skeptical of some of the discourse around species preservation and ecological integrity. And this was sparked in large part by my increasing forays with feminist moral philosophy. Now, I'll tell you right now, this work is really where my heart lies. I am interested and committed to all of my research, but this is truly my abiding interest. So just very quickly, some of the ideas I started to explore are care or compassion as a virtue of conservation, looking at systems of oppression that are embedded in hierarchical relationships, whether between humans or between humans and non-humans, and then examining emotion as a basis for moral understanding and a part of moral experience. So a few different threads of research where this showed up. First, my work with Ariane Wallach, Mark Beckhoff, and others on compassionate conservation. And what this group does is look critically at standard conservation practices like wildlife control and invasive species management, going back to the conversation from a few minutes ago. And they challenge the use of harmful or often lethal tactics to achieve conservation objectives. So their argument is that compassion for individual living creatures needs to be reinstated as a value and a virtue of conservation. So they promote practices like wildlife-friendly farming, for example. Next is my work on trophy hunting, which I'm sure many of you know has been very controversial in recent years. And some conservationists defend the practice by arguing trophy hunting supplies essential funds for conservation and also provides income for local communities. And so they basically use that claim to assert that trophy hunting is justified as a conservation practice. So our contribution to the debate was twofold. First, to point out that that policy position is not somehow value neutral or purely scientific, that people who make that argument are presupposing a certain ethical perspective. And then second, to situate trophy hunting in a longstanding colonial, patriarchal, anthropocentric narrative that's designed to maintain the power of white male upper class humans at the expense of marginalized human and non-human beings. And then finally, moral residue. This is really the work that has most deeply transformed my own view of the world overall. So moral residue gives a name to the case where even a person may act morally in the best way that they can under the circumstances. That action may still implicate them in some amount of moral failure. And that leftover moral failure is what philosophers call a moral residue. So the upshot of this paper is that moral residue is extremely common in conservation. So for example, on the right here, you see the body of a barred owl in the Pacific Northwest. This was shot as a part of a trial program, an experimental removal designed to promote the recovery of the federally listed northern spotted owl. Again, very controversial issue, but the point that I'm trying to make with moral residue is that we can't think about the ethics of that in black and white, even if on the whole, the right thing to do is shoot barred owls to promote the recovery of the northern spotted owls. We still haven't walked a true moral high ground in a very literal and tragic sense. That decision leaves blood on our hands at this point, the blood of thousands of barred owls. And similar with the introduced European rabbit shown on the right or on the left in Australia, also being killed in large numbers for the sake of ecosystem health. And really the point that we emphasize in this paper is that when your decision does leave a moral residue, the right response isn't to be callous or smug or self-righteous or defensive, but to really sit with that discomfort and grieve for the victims of the decisions that you make. So to wrap up, I just wanted to offer some more general thoughts about what skills and inclinations I have that might be useful to you in your work on the board. So methodologically, I have both a quantitative social scientific experience, survey design. I am not a stats wizard by any stretch of the imagination. I enjoy a good F-test here and there, but I would never try to build a career on my statistical prowess. I also have experience with qualitative social scientific methods. I didn't really talk about that work today, but quite a bit of content analysis, as well as experience with interviews and focus groups. And then philosophical work. So I use formal critical thinking, argument analysis. I mentioned that a minute ago. But really the core of my research has been pretty basic and low tech. It's read, think, write, repeat. On the inclination side, I am definitely a big picture thinker. I am pluralistic. I try to look at things from different angles. I'm analytical, I like to take things apart, and I am synthetic, I like to put them back together. And then interstitial. So I think of my work sitting at these points of intersection, whether it be academic fields like biophysical and social sciences with humanities, or applied contexts like the nexus of science management and policy in the Delta. But in any event, my major interests are in these interstices, so these points where the domains collide, and kind of probing that space to see what sort of insights emerge. The last thing I will say, and if there's one point you take away from this talk, I hope this is it. Although I do periodically use scientific methods, I do not consider myself a scientist. This might seem like a trivial matter, but to me, it's actually a pretty important distinction. And the reason is that I am not, as a person, primarily motivated by empirical curiosity. I don't look out at the world and say, like, what is that, or how does that work? The questions that interest me are questions about meaning and significance. And I think science is hugely important, especially insofar as it informs our answers to those kinds of questions. But as a standalone intellectual activity, it doesn't drive me personally. At the same time, though, I am also not a philosopher. I don't have that core disciplinary grounding. I find philosophy interesting and insightful, but I don't personally self-identify as a member of that community. So, where does that leave me? If I'm forced, I will say I'm an inherent interdisciplinarian, which is a terrible term. A mentor of mine used to call me an outlier. Generally, I'm okay not having a label. When I finished my MS, my Master of Science, I used to joke that now science is my slave. And then when I got my PhD, my Doctor of Philosophy, for anybody who's still listening, I would say now philosophy is my patient. Obviously I'm joking, but there's some measure of accuracy in the wordplay. I use science. I try to put it to work for my own purposes. And if I don't exactly fix or cure philosophy, I do sort of repackage it and try to rework it into a form that will be relevant and useful to people working in this environmental and conservation realm. And with that, I will end. Of course, thank you to the various funding organizations and my many collaborators. Thank you all for your time. Again, I really do appreciate having this opportunity. And if there is time, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Chelsea. Welcome to our team. We really look forward to working with you. Any questions from members of the board?
I'd just like to say, I think it's great that you got your start with the H.J. Andrews LTER.
Yeah, it's a good place to be. I'm really sad for a lot of the staff and community members have actually lost homes in these fires. So thinking about them, but yes, thank you.
And I'm glad to hear you got your start at Oregon State. So
also a good place to be. And I am still in Corvallis right now.
You're breathing in the smoke like the rest of us.
I am indeed.
Well,
Okay.
Chelsea, welcome. Can I just say one thing? Do we have time, Steve?
Sure.
So very interesting background. It seems like you've really given a lot of thought to conservation and how it should be done, and that, to be commended for that broad approach. I'm an economist, so, we have a certain moral philosophy that we apply. And so I guess the question is, do you see any problem, say, putting aside your moral philosophy for the purposes of serving a different moral philosophy?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. And I have a lot of actually friends who are in economics, and I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with them about intrinsic value. And I guess at where I am right now, I don't really consider myself a subscriber to any particular moral philosophy. I have kind of a meta view where I like to watch the interplay of how different people see the world through different lenses. And so to that extent, certainly, like I love having those conversations where I hear the economics moral philosophy that, often it's a utilitarian perspective. I think that that's really fascinating. My guess most abiding interest is in creating spaces for conversation where multiple frameworks, multiple lenses for viewing the world have space. Of course, I have my own beliefs and I have my own principles, but I think as a actual intellectual pursuit, I'm definitely able to separate myself from those and consider other perspectives.
I appreciate that, but I also share that with you. Just so you know, they didn't invite any neoclassical economists to this board, so I think we should always be questioning our belief structures that drive our decisions. So I don't see any problem there. But thank you for that thoughtful answer.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again, Chelsea. Any public comments on this item?
Yes, we have one. This is Edmund. We have one from Eric Vink from the DPC. So Eric, I'm going to make you a panelist. So once you're a panelist, please introduce yourself and provide your comments.
Thank you, Edmund. And that was a very interesting presentation. I found it provoking in the very best sense of the word. And Chelsea, I want to thank you for it. I'm not familiar with moral residue. I was really intrigued by that concept, but I was especially wondering your thoughts on, I don't know if you've ventured into the nutria sphere yet at the Delta Stewardship Council, but I would just be curious for your thoughts, if any, related to our concerns about that furry creature that's giving us great consternation.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thank you for your positive comments and thank you for your question. I am aware of the nutria issue. I haven't looked at it in depth quite yet. I've been sort of getting oriented to the whole Delta and haven't had a chance to do any real deep dives into specific issues. But to my understanding, nutria are considered invasive because of various threats that they represent, among others, to the stability of the levees. And so there are, efforts to use lethal management tactics to control the nutria populations. And so what I found in doing this work on moral residue is that oftentimes these cases where there seems to be a hard and fast trade-off, either kill the nutrias and save the ecosystem or save the nutrias and destroy the ecosystem. Oftentimes there's a lot more nuance than that. And so I would want to look more carefully at the empirical evidence, the scientific evidence that surrounds this issue. But if there were, in fact, that hard and fast trade-off, then yes, my take on that would be through the lens of moral residue, which is that if we do have to kill nutria, then we should recognize as managers, decision makers, conservationists, human beings, however you self-identify, we should recognize that we are in a position of power and that we're exercising that power to profoundly affect and in this case destroy other beings' lives, the beings of others or the lives of others who are social, sentient, intelligent, emotional, and sit with that. There's a particular emotional response that should come with that kind of loss, that kind of sacrifice. So rather than just saying, oh, we're doing what we have to do, of course we're justified, and walk away feeling like we've given ourselves a pat on the back, that's, in my mind, that is the wrong way to go about things. We need to get a little bit better about confronting the difficult choices that we have to make as conservationists.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Any other public comments, Edmund?
There are no additional comments.
Steve, is there time for me, this is Susan, is there time for me to ask a question?
Sure.
So thank you for that. I agree with Eric. It's a provocative, in a good way, presentation, and I'm so glad to get to know you in this way. I'm curious, I'm a former Nature Conservancy employee, 12 years with the Nature Conservancy, and my background is also economics, trained in trade-off analysis, input, output analysis, etc. So did you share your findings about the Nature for People campaign? Did you share that with the Nature Conservancy? And if so, what was the response?
That's actually a very good, thank you, first of all. We haven't had the chance to meet personally yet, but thank you for your kind comments. It's nice to be working here. I did not have I guess I shouldn't say I didn't have the chance. I didn't make the opportunity to do that. I did speak with people at the Nature Conservancy. I got some data that they had collected, and they were helpful in informing the development of my project. And then this work was published and I presented it at the Society for Conservation Biology North America Conference, which did have various, attendees from academics and NGOs, but I didn't actually personally convey that. And now that I'm thinking back, I think the reason is that as a person newly foraying into this world of science, I had a whole new appreciation for the smallness of any individual study and the limitations of any individual study. And so I guess I felt a little bit, to be truthful, I felt a little bit intimidated going to the Nature Conservancy and saying, hey, I'm a graduate student. I just did this study that disputes your findings, because I knew kind of the background of how my study had been conducted, and I knew some of the research gaps that still remained. That's not said by way of excuse. And now that you say that, I wish that I had done more targeted outreach. And I do know I got some behind the scenes emails when that paper was published. So I think that some people did see it, but I didn't do anything focused. No.
Mm-hmm. Well, just so you know, when I was at the Nature Conservancy, I also had some misgivings about the nature for people approach. Anyway, thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you.
Okay, at this stage, we were scheduled for a 10-minute break. I'm going to propose we only have a quick 5-minute break. We are running behind schedule. I think we can make up a little time, but we're likely to go to 1 rather than 12:40. Does that present huge problems to anybody? Okay, not seeing any. So let's take just a 5-minute break, and we'll start with item 6. Keeping time.
Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, whenever you're ready. We're still live.
Okay, good. I think I'll go ahead and start then. The next 2 items are largely a brief reviews of status of our ongoing reviews. You have heard a sort of an extensive report on these during the August meeting, so we won't be adding a lot to that. But again, in each of these, we are seeking volunteers to help out with these reviews. And because we've lost a number of the members of the writing teams, we're asking for all of your input on all of these, but particularly in terms of joining a writing team. The first one's water supply reliability, and Jay was going to give that. Is there any update on that? I'll talk to either Joe or Tom.
Joe, why don't you do it, since you seem to know a little bit more than I did?
Well, probably we know the equal amount, but anyway, so we have a good first draft of this. And so the next step, it seems to be, our chair of the committee is Jay Lunt, he's not here today, that we kind of circulate this among the members of the board and get your input, at least the first level input, so that we have advanced kind of a copy that you have vetted already. So if we can circulate that among the board members and get some input, preliminary input, and then we can proceed with the review. So that's the kind of notion I got from Jay. Tom, you have anything to add?
No, but I think that would be a good idea to have the board look at it at this point, because although still a rough draft, it's, I think, getting to the point where it's quite readable.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'll do the monitoring, and then we'll ask if there's any public or further discussion. The monitoring review, Joe and I are the remaining writers on that, and this is a huge, extensive effort, probably the largest review we've ever done, probably the one that has received most interest. I think you're all aware that there was a large contract given to ESSA to provide an inventory of the monitoring programs. And we also have a tool to be able to search that database to plot things up. There's been a survey that was done for people with a variety of questions on this monitoring enterprise review. Also, there's been a draft set of recommendations, and one of the next steps forward was to develop a series of interviews with agency folks to discuss our preliminary reviews and get their feedback. This is a tremendous effort. This is one that will require a lot of input, and probably we're hoping to get at least or to get maybe have 2 more people who want to help us with the coordination and so forth. In the past, when we've done interviews, we've opened those interviews up to various members of the board to be involved in that, so you can see what questions we're asking, what kind of responses we're getting, and so forth. But that's all I really have as an update. Does anyone have any questions? Any board members have any questions or thoughts? I don't expect you to volunteer today because I want to give you time to, after we discuss our timelines, to think about these reviews and to find ones that you feel you can and want to contribute the most of your time on.
Steve, I remember seeing a cross-cut budget that I think came from you. Is that correct?
Cross-cut budget.
Does that ring a bell?
No, but I've been breathing smoke for a week, so
Oh.
Edmund, do you have any? You know what that is?
Yeah, this is the Delta funding initiative cross-cut budget that was presented, I think, at the last DPIC meeting. So that report was public, and then it was distributed to the board. So that cross-cut budget documents all the funding spent on research and monitoring across the DPIC agencies.
Yeah. And the reason I raised it was the new members have gotten copies of it as well.
I can recirculate that afterwards because I think that report was distributed before their terms officially started. So I'll make sure that they have it. They have a copy of it. Okay.
The reason I raise it is I think it puts our monitoring thing in perspective, because you get some sense of the budget spent on monitoring versus science, and how important it is. So.
That's a great suggestion, Tom. Any public comments on these 2 reviews?
We do. We have a public comment from the number ending in 682. I see your hand raised, so I'm going to allow you to talk. Once you're unmuted, please introduce yourself, stating your name and affiliation. So you've been unmuted, 682, whenever you're ready.
Hello, my name is Dr. Tom Williams from Los Angeles, and I am retired, but I did a lot of work in the Benicia area of the Delta and a few others. I have reviewed the twin tube tunnels for the Delta conveyance and have some geological background, biological background, and know quite a bit about the Pleistocene of the Delta and the San Francisco Bay. I am not a board member, you're a board member, but I am available for assisting in any technical review. I am retired, so I must say I have fewer obligations, kind of, but I have some interest in the Delta and especially what's going to happen. That's all.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Any other public comments?
Okay, that is it.
Thanks, Edmund. We'll move on to item 7, which is the 2 more reviews. First one is the Interagency Ecological Program Review. I encourage you all who have read the Invasive to read this one, because I think this one is perhaps on the other extreme of the continuum I talked about, where it's the first time we actually reviewed a specific program. So all of those recommendations go specifically to that program. There is an annual Interagency Ecological Program workshop. It's actually a meeting, and I want to say there's 400 to 500 people that show up for that each year. It's 3 or 4 days long. It's really an instructive workshop to attend because there's just a whole series of presentations. All the people, many of the people working in the Delta, it's a chance to meet them. We as a board have routinely made presentations, usually in one of the plenary sessions, about some of our some of our ongoing activities, and it's also a good chance to really keep up to date. It's annually in March. This year, because of the pandemic, it has gone virtual, and it's running from August 25th through October 13th. There's about 2 half days per week. It's free. There's a half-day session this afternoon on fish, smelt and salmon and some other things. And so you can sign in and listen to those and be involved. We also have a poster at that, and the poster presentation is being by Vince and Liz, who are the lead authors during their term on this particular review. You can go and look at that poster and ask questions, and it summarizes our recommendations for the IEP. We've also made those recommendations specifically to the IEP directors, as well as the IEP director. And I know I've attended some of those. I think Tom has attended some of those workshops as well. So any questions on that one? Okay, the next topic is a science needs assessment activity. And I am really going to shorten my presentation on this, but this is something that was triggered a while ago by a letter we sent to DPIC, a memo pointing out that there's rapid environmental change going on, and we need to really look forward as to what are the scientific capabilities we're going to need in the context of future rapid environmental change, and also on the particularly related to climate impact. And DPIC, which is the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, was responded positively to our recommendation. And at the time, they were doing a review of the funding mechanisms and status within the Delta, as Tom mentioned, in terms of that cross-cut budget. So they added us to that priority. And with both the leadership from DPIC and the Science Advisory Board and help from the science program and the council, we have a 15-person team that's putting together a science needs assessment relative to climate change and relative to rapid environmental change. We were planning to run a workshop this past April. Given COVID, we changed that to a series of 4 discussion topics, 1-hour discussion topics, which we've completed, the last one being in September 9th. And that will be followed up with a workshop on October 5th and 6th. In essence, we're asking the question, what science is going to be, what does science tell us about climate change in the Delta? What does that mean to management? And what are management needs? What are the scientific questions they will need to address? Thirdly, what is the scientific capabilities we'll need to develop in order to answer those management questions? And then fourthly, given that, do we have the proper funding, governance, and leadership in order to accomplish those scientific, in order to develop those scientific capabilities? The workshop we held in this past September 9th was to look particularly at the governance structure, the funding, the leadership capabilities, the interaction among agencies and scientists, and are we in a position, and what do we need in order to develop those scientific capabilities down the road. We had each of these discussion groups, we've had about 100 people attending. We've had Mentimeter questions. We're producing mini reports on the results of those questions. We've had panels that have addressed these topics. And the workshop we're going to hold on October 5th and 6th will be the last step in workshops and activities. And then we plan to write a report of a scientific needs assessment, hopefully by the end of the year. And that will be led or co-led by the Delta Independent Science Board. So Jay Lund and I and Dick Norgard have been the three board members most closely involved with this. I do know some of you have attended some of these discussion groups. The workshop itself on the 5th and the 6th, we have is largely going to focus on the last two items. We're going to have a half day to discuss sort of what are the, and I'm really generalizing here, what are the scientific capabilities that are needed, recognizing the changes that are going to occur. And we're going to talk about those in breakout groups under 8 different topical areas, such as water quality, non-native species, fisheries management, things like that. And then the second day will be a half-day workshop specifically saying, given those scientific capabilities, needs and scientific capabilities, what are the governance structures, leadership needs, and funding structures do we need in order to make that science happen? We have some guests, 2 of the plenary folks we've invited who have accepted. One is Felicia Marcus, who's currently at Stanford and formerly with the California State Water Board Chair, and Peter Goodwin, who's the former Delta lead scientist, has agreed to provide a stimulating plenary discussion to get people to think about those topics. So I do encourage you to volunteer to attend that workshop. It's 2 half-a-days, and because we will be very much involved in putting together the report, I also believe that the things that come out of that workshop will help us develop some new ideas for future reviews down the road. I think there'll be suggestions in there, kind of like taking off of what Liz said earlier, is that the recommendations that come out of that, I think, will naturally lead to things that might need to be pursued in a more detailed review by the board. Alongside with that, we've also been drafting a paper led by Dick Norgard, and that looks at ecology during rapid environmental change. It's a journal article intended for the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science. It'll involve, I think, most of the members of the previous board. I think Virginia has also agreed to be and has been involved in help writing that. We're probably not going to provide any more detailed reports on this because it'll be going to the journal soon. So that's a very rapid summary of those 2, the science needs assessment as well as the IEP. It is, we're probably looking for at least one other person who has the interest in the climate stuff to be to join Jay and I in terms of the taking the leadership on this on behalf of the board in that larger group. So any comments, questions from the board? Amanda, did you want to add anything to that science needs assessment? I went through it really fast.
I doubt it, but I actually just got back on the call, so I'm afraid I was trying to get back in time to hear that update, so my apologies. If anyone has questions, I could probably answer questions.
Okay, again, we'll be one way or another seeking out volunteers to jump in on these various ongoing reviews. Any public comments on these items?
There are none. There are none.
Okay, thanks, Edmund. Okay, the next item is we'll talk about is the preparing for upcoming Delta ISB meetings. And this is we have this on every agenda that we have, but it's a little more meaningful this time because we're facing, I'll make sure I get my notes here. we want to figure out how we're going to move forward in terms of our Delta meetings. I think, as you know, I've expressed earlier about the issues we're facing with the pandemic and others, and I don't, and those things will make challenges about how we can develop camaraderie and so forth. But we're also in a situation where you're all volunteers now, and some of us have been volunteers since July 1st. We know there are efforts to renew some sort of compensation for board members' time. I guess my latest knowledge is we don't know exactly what that compensation would be, and we don't know exactly when something might be resolved. We do know the council's working on this rigorously, but we also, the uncertainty is that it may take months or it may take many months or maybe many, many months before something is resolved. So we have to deal with that uncertainty as well. So one of the basic question on the floor is, we know that all of your time is valuable. We know it's more challenging to ask you to volunteer your time, and we want to come up with a way forward on how we can best achieve our mission and responsibilities and keep everyone interested and involved, given those circumstances. So I have a few ideas on way forward, but and I know I've talked to many of you on this, but I'd like to open it to the floor and see if anyone would like to ask questions or jump in or provide suggestions.
Steve, I know you've talked to a lot of us and individually about this. I'm wondering if you have, if you're hearing themes across the conversations.
I think, and please correct me, I'm not going to generalize that this includes everybody, but I think it was fairly certain that people will not be able to put in as much time, on a volunteer basis and under current conditions as they might have 6 months ago. And I think that given the current circumstances, so I think some scaled down version of our activity is what I'm hearing. There are a couple ways, I'll mention a couple ways to do this and just open them up to the floor. One is we could have, and this is kind of suggested also in, I think, Vince's comments in terms of the general reflections, that our meetings ought to be more focused. And I think that's what we want to do. Much of our work, as you know, takes place outside of meetings. And but one suggestion is that we have very focused meetings and very focused meetings that might just focus on a particular review. And we've already said we would do that with the invasive species. We'd have one meeting that would focus particularly on that review, and whether that's a full board discussion or whether it's a full board invitation discussion, to invite everyone to participate in that or not. Another idea that I heard, which I thought was a good one, is that we also want to have this to be a stimulating opportunity for all the new board members and frankly the continuing board members, and talking about old reviews and finishing up the old board's work is exciting, but it may also be exciting to talk about new ideas. So maybe we have some specific meetings where we spend an hour and someone takes the lead and talks about a possible new topic. Let's take harmful algal blooms, a topic that has interest across all of the disciplines, basically, that we all represent, and a topic that might be of interest. We bring in an expert, they bring us up to date on the status of harmful algal blooms in the Delta for 15, 20 minutes, and we spend the rest of the hour just brainstorming about, is this a valuable review for us to do? What kind of questions would we ask? How do we go about doing this? Who cares? Who has an interest? And put it on the shelf that this is one of the reviews that we might want to pursue or might not want to pursue. but it's an exploratory idea generating, and we could come up with a series of these over the course of the fall, let's say, that would be something that you all would find, you pick those ideas, and we could be ones that we could explore as to possible future reviews down the road. So those two things, very focused, some being specifically on the reviews, whether or not they're full board meetings or full board public invitation meetings, is open to question. And then these sort of the new idea kind of thing, just to provide an hour of stimulation on a topic. And that may also help some of the newer board members to get more immersed in the Delta. Any thoughts or questions, Jim? You're on mute, Jim.
I like this idea of short meetings that have a theme or topic. And I think it would be a good way for the new members to kind of get caught up to speed to some extent on what the Delta is and what the issues are and who the players are, but also as a way to start exploring the kinds of reviews we would be doing in the next year or two. So I just want to give 3 examples, and I'm sure that everybody on the screen here has their own thoughts on the kinds of themes and problems that we could think about. I would be more interested in a session that's maybe a bit longer than an hour. And I was thinking about cyano harmful algal blooms in the Delta. This is a problem that began in the late 1990s. It's becoming a recurrent problem. It seems like it's getting worse. And I was thinking that as an example, the way we could structure this is invite 3 people to give presentations. So somebody like Hans Perl at the University of North Carolina, who's a global expert on this problem. He could talk about the fundamentals of cyano-HABs. And then Rafe Kudela at UC Santa Cruz could bring in a California perspective. And then Peggy Lehman, who works for the Department of Water Resources, who's the person who works on HABs in the Delta. And give them each maybe 20 minutes to give a presentation. And then we have a discussion after that. And the purpose would be a first step, and I think this is aligned with what you're talking about, Steve, a first step towards exploring the question, is this something that we want to dive deeper into in the next year or two, or for whatever reason we don't. Just 2 other examples of the kinds of themes, and then I'll stop. The theme of habitat restoration. So the state of California has some pretty ambitious goals for habitat restoration in the Delta. There are specific targets for adding back different habitat types. Some restoration projects are in place, others are planned. So I could imagine the same kind of format where we bring in people who are actively engaged in the restoration process, and we learn about things like what is on the books, what progress has been made, what's coming up in the next 5 years. Are there performance metrics? What are they? Is monitoring tied into restoration? How do we know if we're succeeding or not? And then the third example came from the non-native species review. And this is one that I think and I mentioned this earlier, that a lot of people are interested in, and that is a quantitative food web model for the Delta. So those are just 3 examples of the kinds of themes that we could build maybe 2-hour, hour-and-a-half meetings around that would help get people up to speed on what some of the important issues are, and be an exploratory step towards thinking about what kinds of problems we want to work on in the next couple of years. And I would certainly be willing to give 2 hours a meeting for these kinds of events.
Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, Bob.
Steve and others, I guess I'm probably going to be an outlier on this, but it seems as though even having meetings that are very, very focused, for those of us that are, live outside the region, it's a steep learning curve. I think, for all of us to become articulate about what the issues are and what we might be able to do. And I'll speak for myself, any one of these topics, trying to, even though the topics are general, trying to apply them in a specific way to the Delta means many, many hours of reading and thinking and talking to people before I think you can feel like you can have an intelligent and productive conversation. And so with all of that in mind, it's great to come to a meeting like this and listen for a couple of hours, but it's very hard to make concrete suggestions that are going to be productive for the longer term. At least I feel in my case, that's what it's going to be. And so I'm starting to fall on the side of actually calling for a hiatus of our activities for the foreseeable future until such time as we actually understand what the contracts might be. We have, I know the council and the staff have done a lot of work in trying, to bring something about, but we still don't know the details of what that might be. And I can, in order to be a productive member of the group, I can see myself putting in hours and hours and hours of work into this, as you've done, Steve, and so on, without any sort of form of compensation. And so I guess, I'm starting to feel more and more strong about this, is that I think a hiatus for a month or two to see where things fall out would be a very prudent move. And then once we understand what the forms of compensation might be, I, and hopefully others, are more than willing to jump back into this with both feet and really go forward with a lot of energy and passion. But until that time comes, until I see what the compensation might be or what the rules or the package might be, I'm starting to feel as though I'm just not sure. I'm starting to feel very ambivalent about things. So that said, I'll stop there.
Okay, Jim?
Bob, I was not talking about doing any kind of follow-up analysis or reading or deep dives into any of these themes. What I'm talking about is perhaps 10 hours of our time between now and the end of the year.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thanks for that clarification. That seems very reasonable.
So Jim, you're talking 10 hours per month or 10 hours for the rest of the year?
If we did a meeting like this, a 2 hour, hour and a half meeting in October, November, and December, that's 3 meetings. So we'd spend 2 hours in those meetings, and we could each give a couple of hours to help organize one of them. So a total of 10 hours to have 3 meetings like this.
So the meetings are more or less exploratory and introductory to figure out what the topics are.
Absolutely.
No background prep.
I'm a little bit afraid of a hiatus because if the hiatus lasts a while, it's easy for people to forget that we have an ISB, and I think that's a risk that we might be taking.
Tanya?
Yeah, I appreciate your concerns, Bob. Just about investing a lot of time and effort to learning and getting up to speed. The flip side for me is that I feel like I need to maintain some momentum in my learning. And, I don't want to find out, oh, now we're getting paid, and then all of a sudden we have to just dive so far deep into the deep end without having kind of maintained some kind of, base of knowledge and development, and some opportunity to build, some camaraderie amongst the board members too. So, I think that's probably more of an individual level decision, how much time you're willing to kind of commit to that. But, I certainly feel willing to keep up with some level of meetings and some of these reports that, there's already been momentum on writing these reports. If, we need to kind of keep chipping away at those as best we can. you know, I'm willing to put some volunteer hours into just kind of maintaining that sense of cohesion and knowledge building. But yeah, I hear your concerns, Bob.
So I wanted to make a few comments as well.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Bob, I definitely agree with your perspective that it's easy to jump in and be engaged. And so I appreciate the thought on how to limit this. But you know, Jim, when you mentioned Hans Perl's knowledge on algae blooms, it reminded me, I was involved in a study of epoxy in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was a big committee. There were about 24 of us. And what really helped us more than anything was to develop a conceptual diagram of all the forces that were affecting hypoxia in that cases. But to me, as a big picture person, if we could have speakers who would help us develop kind of this conceptual understanding of the major forces in the Delta, and some might be really important for habitat and others might be important, you know, for changes in food web, but to have that kind of understanding and try to have a few meetings to work toward that, unless it already exists and I haven't seen it, that would be most helpful to me to be at a position where when things changed, I'd be able to jump into it with some kind of broad understanding and then look at some of the particular questions.
Say, Virginia, were you thinking about when you say the sort of the conceptual understanding of the nature of the Delta, does that mean scientifically, or are you also thinking about sort of the various management entities involved and what their role is?
Really all of those. So, you know, on hypoxia, we had an oceanographic team and a social science team with economists and social scientists, as well as the ecologist team that dealt with plants and animals, you know, in the water and on the land. But I can send you a diagram, Steve, of what we developed for hypoxia, kind of as an example. And one of Hans's students actually drew it up for us, but it gave me a better understanding of where the major pressures were. And then when you pick a particular problem, you can say, well, you know, like air quality didn't end up being that important to us, but it was something we had to think about. And agency decisions are really playing an important role here. But you know, I like to have a piece of paper kind of with all of these influences drawn out to some extent. And I know that's a huge task, but I think if we go for the big picture view of it, we might be able to do it. And you guys have been involved in this for a longer time, know if that's just ridiculous for this complex system or not.
Okay, Del,
Can I make a quick comment? And also we have to think about this water fix, the EIR. That's a huge job coming up some point, right? So I don't know where it stands, but if it comes, I don't know how we can handle that part too. Because last time we spent enormous amount of time on that. So it's a lot of things in the along the road. So hopefully we can sort things out pretty quickly.
is there anyone on the line, like Susan, do you have any idea what the timeline is for the water fix, whatever it's called now?
Hey, Steve, I think Susan's no longer on the line, but Carrie Buckman provided a presentation at the last meeting. The EIR, it seems like she didn't have a very good deadline or timeline of when that will be out for public comments, but when pushed for like some sort of estimate, she said early 2021.
Okay.
Based on our last discussion at the public meeting.
So we seems to be okay with that then.
Yeah, depending on how long this goes on. And I think the I agree with you, Joe. That's an absolutely huge effort, and I doubt we could do it on a volunteer basis.
Yeah. But it might be useful to have some background, a little more background information on it in the interim to get us, you know, get our brains kind of prepped for it when it does come, if, you know, depending on timing and all of that. But
The last one we did for BDCP had, I think, 35,000 pages for us to review. And
Yeah, something shorter than that.
our review was, I think, pushing 200 pages. So we think this will be a less of a version, but we don't know. So Lisa, you have any thoughts?
I think people have articulated my thoughts very well. I mean, I think Bob's point is really well taken, that we could easily get in over our heads if we didn't devote enough time. I see that as a real threat, but I really appreciate, I think where we landed, which is that, well, if we can keep building our knowledge base, we'll be better prepared for when we finally can dig in. And I'd certainly be willing to volunteer, some time to keep building my knowledge base, because it does seem like there's a lot to learn.
I think Diana's signed off. Is that true? Or was lost?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And I want to express Jay's, I did talk to Diane about this particular topic, and she's, and I don't want to necessarily, she was more along the lines of doing something but scaling down, and Jay was more along the lines of doing something and scaling down. The science needs assess, so that's, we've gotten some ideas of possibly having some meetings and a scale down. You don't prepare for these meetings. And what I'm hearing is we definitely want to scale down our meetings, and we have to scale down our level of effort to some way. I still am struggling to figure out how we handle the our ongoing reviews. I think we've decided more or less to go forward with some targeted meeting on the invasive species, and a couple of people have volunteered to help with that. The science needs assessment, I know Jay and I have agreed to, we're committed to continue that because we've put a lot of effort into that on our own volunteer basis. If someone wanted, and that will go forward because it involves others. The water supply reliability and and particularly the monitoring, it's going to require people stepping up and volunteering their time in order for that to progress, because I think in monitoring, it's just Joe and I and we'd still have to volunteer our own time. So I'm calling everybody volunteering, not just the new people. And the water supply reliability, I think it's Tom, Joe, and Jay are involved in that again, which would involve volunteer time. So how we move forward on those is, any thoughts on that? Jim.
Why not table those two, water supply reliability and monitoring?
Yeah, this is Tom. I think I'd rather pursue it because we really have the momentum right now, and to walk away from it for an extended period of time. How do you feel, Joe?
I feel the same way because we had to do a lot of background reading and information put together. So I think we should continue some form of momentum there. So I agree with you, Tom.
Of course, if we have 3 members of the writing team, Jay's not here, but if that group decides to continue at whatever level they're continuing, and I think they're working on a report, at some stage they'll of course need to bring it back to the full board, and many stages along the road. And at that stage, maybe at that stage we have the board decide whether or not they're ready to do anything with it. And the full board at that stage could say, well, we don't have the time. And it's kind of like we did today with the invasives. We didn't make a decision. We decided to postpone it until we had more time to look at it. So is that a reasonable way forward with that one, Joe and Tom?
I think the way we've approached the water supply reliability review, it could end up being a journal article. So in a worst case scenario, we just divert to that.
But still, if it's going to be a board, we did a prospectus, if it's going to be a board product, it has to come back to the full board for discussion. And
it wouldn't be a board. The worst case scenario is there's no board. So.
Well, that's a possibility to take it outside is to, in essence, what you're saying from a board perspective is to ultimately not do the review as a board.
Yeah, functionally, that's the way it would go, but the document itself would survive.
You mean the water supply reliability, Tom? I didn't get it. Is that the water? Is the monitoring? Which one?
The water supply reliability.
Water supply reliability.
I think that was our intent from the beginning, that it eventually would become a journal article.
So the monitoring one, now Joe and I are the only continuing people on the monitoring one. And Joe, what's your thought about putting that on hiatus for a while, or
I think that might be best interest to all of us because it's a huge document. And as you said, it's the largest we ever undertook probably, including material coming from ESSA and so much other information. So maybe we can kind of tone it down for a while till things get settled. Because both of them, and for me, water supply reliability and monitoring, that might be a little bit too much. And also probably you feel the same way, Steve, right? Because it's a large document.
Yeah, I absolutely feel the same way on that one. It's going to take a lot of effort. So maybe what I would suggest is that there's a lot of material for that, and I'm going to look at Edmund's name on here, and I don't know if in any one spot if there is the most important things for that review, and maybe we could do that. What I'm thinking about is the prospectus, the things that have already been made public, the prospectus, the ESSA reports, the questionnaires we've prepared, maybe the results of those questionnaires if they've been made public, and any draft that is also public. Put those in one place and let the board members at their leisure on a volunteer basis to have a look at that, because I know almost everyone has an interest in monitoring, but have a look at that over the next few months, 3 months, 4 months, so that we're in a position that if and when this is resolved, we can go full bore again. And at that stage, if people have had a chance to review that material, maybe there's a couple people that can then say, that's the one I want to lob onto and get involved in. And but if we give it to them at their leisure in one spot, so they don't have to, do a lot of extraneous reading, but just see where we are and where we've gone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Steve, this is Edmund. So we do already have a box location for that, and I can just send it to individual board members. But as a warning, that's over like 600 pages worth of pages to look into in the future.
Well, that was eventually if that's going to be required. So at least in terms of those that step into the writing team. So I think, but ultimately there are some things I know in the ESSA report, there's a big chunk of it is on methodology and things like that. And one could, it's a glossy, at least two glossy reports. You could dive into just looking at the final recommendations, and there's ways to skim read it to get a sense. Any other thoughts before I try and summarize where I think we are? Okay, let me put this forward as a possibility, is that we would have, we understand everyone's on a volunteer basis. So we would have, for the next, I'm going to say for the, until we have a resolution of this issue, but at least we can reassess this at any time, given the uncertainty. But I would say it looks like for the next, the rest of this year, which is only 3 or 4 months, unless there's a resolution earlier than that, what we would do is try and schedule a series of, I'll call them topical seminars, and how many is to be decided, 1 to 2 hours for that people could sit in and just openly discuss new ideas as recommended by Jim, you know, and that would be one set of meetings. We'll have a meeting specifically to discuss a full board on the invasive species topic and decide whether we need any future ones for that. We're putting on the monitoring on hiatus. Water supply reliability is going to be pursued with the 3 writers, and at some stage they can maybe get back to us as a board and see whether or not we're in a position to make further comments, or you're in a position to jump ship and publish it. And in terms of the science needs assessment, we're going to continue to move forward. I know Jay and I are committed to do that. We welcome anyone else, any individual, 1 or 2, who wants to help us out with that, to volunteer and let me know, and we will add them to the team. Trying to think now. With that, I'm also going to suggest that people think about the topics, the kinds of ones that Jim mentioned. Each of you may have other ideas, and if you want to mail them to me or Edmund, what we will try, and along with suggested speakers and with the commitment you might want to take on as to help moderate that session or something, particularly for something you really have an interest in. And then we'll try and set these up over the course of this year. Probably no more than, well, we only have three more months left, but I suppose we could do 4 meetings or something like that. And if you mind leaving it up to the leadership team to make those kind of decisions, we could do that. Jim.
I propose that we have 2 thematic meetings and 1 meeting to talk about the non-native species. So that's 3 meetings between now and the end of the year. And I really think that one of the thematic meetings should be about water fix, because it's so big. It's a commitment that's been made. So then the question is, what's the other one going to be about?
I would suggest, we did have a little bit of presentation in August on the water fix thing. I think I'm not, what basically we're going to be doing is reviewing an environmental impact statement. And it's going to be a little bit, we're reviewing a document rather than writing a document. And so it takes on a little bit different than the thematic. And if they're talking early next year, I would think that even if we did something next year in January, it would be more than enough time to get prepared for that.
Okay, that seems reasonable.
Do we want to talk about the themes or and make a decision here and what sort of themes we should pursue? Jim mentioned 3. Bob, you're saying no. What does that mean? What does a no mean? Go ahead.
Well, no means I'm getting close to being out of time, and this sounds like a longer discussion. So
okay, good. Let's move forward. Go ahead.
Just one last thought. On the one report that you're planning to keep pushing forward, we need a meeting on that? I mean, other than the invasive species, sorry, the other report.
No, because we're going to have the workshop on October 5th and 6th, and at that stage, we're going to decide what the next steps are. And by that, we'll be moved on towards writing teams at that stage.
Okay, well, but that's a good point. We have a workshop in addition to planned meetings, so maybe 2 is enough.
And the workshop is optional, of course, but anyone who wants to join in on that that writing team, hopefully they can attend that workshop. Okay. I'm not sure how we move forward about actually picking the themes, but why don't we do this? Why don't you send us if you have any other ideas, any other themes, just send us an email. the leadership team will put them together and see if we can come up with a proposal for a couple of meetings. And if we only get 2 out of the 3, we'll get the next one in January. And again, don't forget, if you'd like to join in that conversation, it does not commit you to be chair-elect nominee. It just gives you an opportunity to have some fun. Okay. Otherwise I'll be calling. Who is that? Okay. Well, I don't think then we need to talk about any other science items. Is there any public comment on this topic?
There are none, but just for the record, I'll be correcting any references to WaterFix to the Delta Conveyance project because it's a completely new project.
Thank you. Well, Edmund, do you want to go through with the follow-up items? Did you get detailed notes?
Sure, I'll try to be quick since I know we're behind schedule, so I'll send them out by tomorrow. I think you did a great summary in terms of preparation for future meetings. But in terms of follow-up items for individual board members, please continue to think about topics that you're interested in learning more about so we can have focused seminar discussions. Just email those to Steve and myself and any suggested panelists that you may have. So you guys agreed, you guys didn't take any action on the ecosystems review today, but I think we got some volunteers in the form of Lisa and Jim to help move that forward in the future. And we'll discuss more of that in terms of next steps. I think Steve did open it up to written feedback. So I know you guys are taking a more of a reduced workload. So it'll be up to you if you want to provide any editorial suggestions based on what you read. There were a lot of suggestions to circulate materials on my end, and I'll make sure that you guys have all of those in your inbox, including all the resources for the monitoring enterprise review and all of the other resources for water supply for your reading pleasure if you have time or interest. So I'll provide a more detailed update by email, but I know we're short on time.
Thanks, Edmund. Any public comments on items that are not on the agenda?
There are none, but I noticed, Virginia, you've been having your hand raised for a while. I just assume you just have to lower it. And other than that, no public comments.
Okay, well, folks, I really appreciate your time. I'm sorry for running over, and we'll try and be more succinct at our future meetings, and hopefully maybe we can do some. Anyway, we're aware of your time constraints, so take care, everyone. Be safe, be healthy, and officially adjourn the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.